Hi, everybody, and welcome to all those listening in. I'm Samar Kataria. I'm Director of Strategy at 2X Global, and we're really excited to host this dialogue with you today. Just a little bit of background on 2X Global. We are a global organization at the forefront of unlocking gender smart capital at scale. We represent also the coming together of Gender Smart and 2X Collaborative. We've been around since the beginning of this year, and our work is organized around three strategic pillars that span building capacity, advancing standards, and shaping and shifting the markets. Climate and gender finance has always been a core theme of our work at 2X Global, from producing a range of knowledge products to convening the global community of investment actors across the spectrum, to shaping and shifting standards of climate finance and making sure that they integrate a gender lens well. So we're excited to be diving into this conversation with you today, which will be focused on accelerating inclusive finance by deepening the gender and climate lens. We have two incredible speakers with me here today, Ajayta Shah and Sharon McPherson. And before I introduce them briefly, I'm going to set a little bit of context for the why, the what, and the why now of climate and gender finance. So as a field of gender lens investing more broadly, we've made tremendous progress over the last years. Under the 2X Challenge, for example, we've mobilized 27.7 billion in gender finance, but you compare that with the broader ESG flows of over $1 trillion, we know we have a long way to go. If I zone in on climate finance more specifically, at the end of 2021, the most recent data suggests that there's about 600 billion mobilized in climate finance, and just 1% of that had a gender lens. If you start to look at the data at a more disaggregated level and think about women of color in particular, the numbers are sub 1%. So yes, we've made great strides. Yes, it's amazing to see the progress and the integration of climate investors, including a gender and broader social inclusion lens into their work. But we know that if we're developing resilient, sustainable solutions for the future, that incorporating a gender lens not only is a way to mitigate risk, but also to tap into immense opportunity. As we'll hear from our amazing speakers today, women and women of color in particular are not only at the forefront and bear the brunt of the impacts of climate change, but they're also coming up with the most amazing solutions and providing innovative and inclusive finance to the players on the ground. So without further ado, I'd love to bring up our speakers today. We have Ajayta Shah, who is the founder and CEO of Frontier Markets. She wears many, many hats, but we'll focus on bringing that one to the fore today, as well as Sharon McPherson, who's co-founder and CEO of Resilience Technologies, and we'll speak more about the Green Jobs Machine, and was also the ex-co-founder, I should say, and former CEO of the Windy Consortium. So we're really, really grateful to have you both online today. And maybe just as you settle into your seats, an opening question so that people get to know you both a little bit more is, can you rewind for us a bit and share a bit more of your personal journeys and why this field of climate and gender finance matters in what you do today? And maybe Ajayta, I'll start with you first.
Sure. Thanks so much, Sana, for organizing this. And, what a relevant and important topic, especially as we're coming out of Climate Week and really starting to bring together the right voices. So very quickly on my own journey, I guess I've been working in rural India now for about 20 years. And when I first started thinking about, big problems and big ideas, you can imagine India is quite large, right? We have 1.43 billion people in the country, and of which, over 80% live in rural parts of the world, right? 700,000 villages. And if you think about the vulnerability and the challenges, we tend to experience that only when you're in the field. And I got a chance to do that when I was 20. So I started working in the microfinance sector and really getting a chance to witness the resilience, the aspiration, the opportunity, but also the challenges that really rural families face where they live. And ultimately, what was really exciting was getting a chance to also see the power and the strength of women. So really, when looking at the microfinance sector, we built an entire industry around lending to women because women were the critical nexus of change and aspiration and opportunity. I think that from there, extremely inspired, right? Working in several states of the country, working with millions of rural women, I set up my company, Frontier Markets, which essentially was going to be filling a different gap, which was an access gap. Recognizing that while financial services exist, holistic poverty alleviation requires market linkages beyond finance, looking at the space of agriculture, digital payments, digital inclusion, looking at training capacity building, et cetera. So we built a company that was really based on this idea of how do we better leverage the voice of the people that are big markets, and how do we essentially help them get access to services they need at scale. Today, we also learned that when we are trying to truly win the hearts and minds of rural people and get an understanding of who they are and what they need, once again, no surprising, women are at the center of this, right? Women are really the critical people that build trust in communities. They help us gather insights. They also help us become champions of change. So we built a company around that. And today, 35,000 women entrepreneurs have helped over 3.5 million rural families get access to millions, 50 million plus services. Where does this link to me? So the gender piece, obviously, I think everyone understands that I believe women are incredible market makers. They're assets, they're influencers, they're needed to create smart business, and hence being the center of impact in terms of investments as well. But where the climate piece comes in for my journey is that when you're working in a place like rural India, you can imagine that climate is at the center of everything. In the last just even 5 years, we've seen drastic climate change realities that have put people from the top all the way down to the bottom in an instant. So the vulnerability that we see of climate is very critical, but also the opportunity. When you look at women and you look at rural India, the farming agriculture space, women are at the center of it. We have over 500 million small women farmers in the country who ultimately not only are at the center of that climate change challenge, but are very, very, very ready to change it, fix it, and solve it for the rest of the world. And so that's kind of where our inspiration for the last couple of years has been: how do we really elevate the power of small women farmers to become the climate solvers of the world? Because we do, again, believe that they are the center and influence of change.
Amazing, Jay. Thank you so much. And also those numbers speak for themselves in terms of the impact that you're having. It's fantastic. Sharon, maybe coming to you for your journey.
You want me to speak after that? Are you kidding me? Oh my God. I love it. I love hearing you speak at data. My background is in banking and law, and that's relevant because for most of my career, I left Wall Street, but I've been investing in women differently across about 14 markets in sub-Saharan Africa. And I mentioned the background in law and banking because part of really what gets me out of bed in the morning is shifting capital at scale into investing differently. If you read the various studies, I think it's the World Bank has recently released its numbers. We need to invest $4.2 trillion. McKinsey also ballpark figures in resilience. We're going to come back into what is resilience, because there's a lot of complexity that's inherent in understanding. But that is really the seam that cuts across just about everything I've been doing for the last 26 years. So I teach project finance at the University of Cape Town's Graduate School of Business. That really got me into looking at the built environment differently, right? And looking and realizing that, first of all, the built environment is not gender neutral. Playgrounds are not gender neutral. What is gender neutral? We don't think about these things, right? And so project finance is the asset class for funding infrastructure. And so I teach that at the University of Cape Town. I've been involved with structuring public-private partnerships for a sustainable and inclusive built environment for a long, long time. And one of the things that has become very clear to me is that one of those P's is problematic, and that's the private sector. So we'll come back to that when we talk about what my wish list is. But a lot of what I've been doing, whether it's helping to conceptualize the Africa 50 Fund, helping to conceptualize a number of iconic programs in Africa with various development, WeFi, the program of FAWA. So what I like to do is quietly be behind the scenes, using my capacity to ideate and be a systems thinker, to take what are actually programmatic approaches to what so often is project-based funding. Climate by its very nature is complex. And so when you think about gender smart investing, and then you think about climate investing, these are two incredibly complex areas. How do you get the private sector? How do you incentivize the private sector to shift capital at scale into what they really don't understand? That's the core of my work. I am the former CEO and co-founder of what is Africa's largest women's infrastructure investment group. We've got over 2,500 women-owned and operated vetted SMEs and one investment company. And our MO is to invest in big projects, and then we put the women to work. Women in infrastructure, women in engineering, women in energy, women in transport and logistics, because we believe in proximate leadership. We believe that as financial intermediaries, what we have to do is we have to count what we can count. And we have to really be strategic about how we shift capital and how we grow those SMEs on the back of procurement. And that's what we've been. We've impacted over 1 million people. We've created over 2,000 sustainable and quality jobs. That's what I'm all about. That's what I'm talking about. Right now, I'm sitting in Washington, D.C. I was asked to do policy advisory work looking at the intersectionality of climate, national security, and infrastructure. And that's important because, you know, I've been playing with the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, Department of Transportation here in the United States. But I went and got the women's group, right? You know, there is a group in Washington called the Women's Group. And I'm like, why are you not in this, right? And so, again, bringing together government, private sector to invest differently in proximate leaders in frontline communities is what I'm all about. So I'm very happy with the work that I've been able to do here in Washington, which has had an impact on big pieces of legislation like the Inflation Reductions Act, the American Jobs Creations Act. And instead of taking a job with the administration, I decided at my age, I'm going to launch a tech startup. So that's Resilience Technologies. And it's really because we've been talking a lot about adaptation and mitigation, but not enough about resilience. And that's critical for how we invest differently in women. So we can, I'll stop there, but we can come back to this intersectionality of women and climate as we go deeper in the conversation.
Fantastic, Sharon. Thank you so much. And I really appreciated the point in terms of why even in something as big and mammoth as infrastructure needs a gender lens and almost needs a care lens as well, as part of thinking about what it means to develop inclusive climate finance solutions and policy. I actually maybe want us to come back. You brought up policy, and there was something that was coming up for me in terms of collaborations, because each of you has adopted this very collaborative, inclusive model. So maybe, Ajitha, coming back to you here for a moment, like how have you really built up the solutions that you have in proximity with people on the ground and built up these collaborative
so I think
approaches at scale?
Yeah, so I think so there was an interesting conversation in one of the conferences I was at this week where we were talking about what is the difference to build for scale versus scaling up. And, you know, when you're building for scale, you're actually taking a cognizant approach of thinking about who are the right players that are involved to actually build for scale. And so, and some of that is ultimately about infrastructure, organizations, channels, networks, but also ideally what you're doing is you're coming in with a lens that whatever it is that each partner does, they do it so well. And that's the only thing that they will be doing. Everyone runs in their own lanes. So we can actually reach that level of scale. And I'll give you a very tangible example of that in terms of how we've been doing this in India. So we obviously are obsessed with rural women, right? I think that was pretty clear from my opening. If you look at the government infrastructure today in the country, because of their efforts and because of their systems that they established 40 plus years ago, you have over 80 million women that are a part of a collective, right? A self-help group initiative, which is very organized and structured and systematic, where women have identifications, they have bank accounts, they have a system in place, right? 80 million, that's a beautifully large number, right? I mean, and in one country, right? And so ultimately, how does one leverage that incredible infrastructure to then reach your goals? So one for us was, how do we ensure that we're connecting with the government, because they also were aligned in terms of policy and vision. So the government today does want to see economic empowerment for women. They do want to see a better role of upliftment for rural India when it comes to, and they are becoming cognizant about climate realities. So they have an intentionality, they have an infrastructure. What they don't necessarily have are the right capabilities, the right technology, the right capital structures, or the right solutions. So great. How do we then bring that in? And I think that so, and then of course, a lens that I think was really critical, which unfortunately most governments don't necessarily have, but I think women leaders that are in the market space do, an unapologetic feminist consumer lens, right? And so when you're bringing that consumer lens and that feminist lens into this model, we are consciously trying to get the voice of those rural women out. The more that voice comes out of those rural women, the more they're telling us what they want to build. Even if it's 10 million women that want the same thing, that's a market, right? And so ultimately, being able to then bring that through a tech platform, which is what Frontier Markets obviously offers, we also then were able to bring the right solution partners. So the climate space, again, as Sharon said, is complicated, right? It's not one solution. So whether it's the renewable energy space with DREs, whether it's smart agri, whether it's climate finance, or whether it's just financial services, these are all very different solutions. But if bundled together based on one common KPI, which is we want to hear the voice of women and elevate their opportunity to be better, all of a sudden you're co-designing very differently. And then you're testing that, designing and testing that. Now, the design and test piece, again, when it comes to capital partners, is interesting. Who's going to pay for the risk? Who's going to pay for that foundation building? And that is obviously where we believe the role of philanthropy plays. And it's been fantastic to see that, right? Catalytic financing coming in to help build the momentum to then unlock revenue or unlock debt, and then eventually unlock the private sector. So we've been able to design that holistically, being led through a foundation initiative where we were saying that it takes government, channel partners or collectives on the ground, it takes market solution players, it takes blended capital, and most importantly, it takes a common tech platform with data. And I guess what we've learned is it takes a pioneer. So you need someone at the helm to champion this in some sort of way and push everyone. But it works quite well if we're all able to align with a common vision, which in this case was, how might we solve climate challenges, but also elevate the power of women? And if that can come together to then unlock market, it's a beautiful combination.
Amazing, Ajay. Thank you. That all just comes together so beautifully. And the aspect, as you said, of really catalyzing capital and the role that that capital plays in making these things come to fruition. Maybe Sharon will build on that a little bit, because this is part of what you're teaching, project finance. Every day you've been around and done your career, as you said, began in finance. Do you feel that we've made enough progress as it comes to furthering such solutions, or what more would you like to see with the role of bringing together public and private capital to support inclusive climate and gender finance solutions?
I don't. Thanks for the question, Sana. I don't think we've done enough. And I do want to pick up on one of the points that both you made in your opening remarks about why the 2X Collaborative exists, and also one of the points that Ajay just made about capacity building. So capacity, so often, we funders, we like humility. We think we know it all, but we don't. And so being humble and then understanding that we within the funding community actually need capacity. We need better capacity in order to innovate and in order to dig deeper into systems for funding in places where capital hasn't been flowing previously. Capital flow, that's the investor's dilemma. Capital flows where capital has always been flowing. And so getting capital to flow into frontline communities, which I define as communities that are bearing the first and the worst of climate, adverse climate events, those communities are marginalized because we haven't been investing in them. And then all of a sudden you want to bring the complexity of gender smart investing, the complexity of solving for climate, and you want to say, hey, we want capital to flow where capital hasn't been flowing at scale. And right now, because we've got to survive. I mean, come on, right? How do you solve that? So for part of why I didn't take a job in the administration is because I think so often what we do need is people who have a private sector mindset. And so, Sana, to answer your question, I am always ABC, always be calculating, right? I think we've got to take that feminist energy, and we've got to come and we've got to say, hey, we have to always be calculating. And that's what I learned as both an investment banker and a lawyer. Folks in the private sector are always calculating. How do I minimize losses? How do I maximize profitability? They're thinking about their own investors. If they're GPs, they're thinking about their LPs. They're thinking about their shareholders. And so part of what I'd like to see happen, and one of the reasons why I'm launching this resilience tech platform, is because for the last 2 years, we have been figuring out how do you better incentivize the private sector to invest differently in some of the most marginalized places on the planet. How are you going to get that capital there? We know it needs to flow, and we know governments are willing, but too often they don't have the real capacity to do it on their own. You need public-private partnerships. But if private sector folks are always calculating, how do we then help them? And so part of what we're doing and what we've been doing for the last 2 years is we've developed 7 subdomains of how do you measure resilience. And we have 139 indicators. And within 5 years, we can have trillions of data points about how resilience investing really works. So that I can go to an insurance company, or I can go to an infrastructure investor, or I can go to a commercial bank, and I can say, Sana told you to put your money over here. Ajayda told you to put your money over here. You're calculating. This is exactly how you've reduced vulnerability and increased resilience, but we can backtrack and say, and here's how this has impacted your resilience score as a business. So that you begin to connect the dots between a business's resilience and vulnerability and the resilience and vulnerability of the operating environments and the communities that they serve. It's all connected, but you've got to get businesses to cross over that bridge. And what's at the middle of that bridge is the investor's dilemma. So that's what I wish. And instead of just wishing, I said, you've got to have that leadership, and you've got to have that chutzpah to get out there and to wade into that complexity and to try to simplify so that you make the investment proposition clear and compelling.
Amazing. So we shouldn't forget our ABCs and
ABCs,
this amazing resilience score. I love it. I think that, there's so much right now in terms of better quantifying and speaking to gender and social inclusion in a more mainstreamed way, and being able to really measure resilience and reduced vulnerability is on a lot of investors' minds. So excited to see more. So maybe as we close out, I'll turn to each of you with the same question. Is there something that you're most excited and hopeful by in this moment? And do you have a call to action for our listeners?
So yeah, I'll put this in the context of what my journey has been from being an entrepreneur to now becoming an ecosystem enabler, I guess is the phrase that everyone uses these days, is that there was a need for a shift to actually bring in an entrepreneurial perspective to start building coalitions and building collaboratives to kind of address the challenge at scale. What's exciting is that there's not that much pushback, right? Like actually there is a clear need in the market, which I think is great, right? I mean, whether it is private sector companies that are thinking about products, they're starting to understand why they need a gender lens, which is amazing. I think that because of the role of technology and data and the power of that can come together, I think there's a huge opportunity here for us to really push data-centric driven outcomes that actually brings everyone together. And I think that there is finally a common understanding of why blended capital is critical, right? And I think we're all finally starting to align and understand that it's not one or the other, it's actually a pathway. And how do we come together to build that pathway more effectively to improve our agenda? It's why we launched the She Leads Fund. So, when we launched the She Leads Fund, so I've been told I need to call it She Leads Fund and not She Leads Bharat Fund. And I'll tell you why. Because when I was at Climate Week, everyone's like, why is this just focused on India, Ajayta? This is a no-brainer. This should be coming globally. And I said, fair enough. We start with India as a demonstration because it is pretty large. And if you can reach 100 million people quickly, then it makes it very easy to prove business cases everywhere else. And so, but the fund really was bringing together catalytic capital. And what's been great is that there's an alignment of the right partners who are saying, yes, we're ready to hear the voice of rural women. Yes, we want to believe that women, small farmers are going to be the climate changers of the world. And yes, we're ready to bring in the right kind of capital to make that journey happen. So that's quite exciting. So call to action, anyone that wants to be involved in a coalition ecosystem developed model where you believe that your capital can be put to work in an interesting way to find the nexus of gender, climate, and markets, message, call, tell Sana, because we are obviously wanting to build an entire leadership of people coming in with one common KPI, which is elevation of women. So that's my exciting hopefulness that it will come to fruition in a really large way. And I hope that other people can join that. So, yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you for giving voice to those communities. And Sharon, what is exciting you in this moment?
Listen, my call to action is also a call, a real call, as in like be in touch. I am going to be the resilience lady. That's all you got to think about. You think about resilience, it's like, hey, there's this lady. One of the things, the call to action is for us to educate ourselves and to understand how adaptation is different from resilience and how mitigation is different. One of the biggest challenges of that I had in terms of Climate Week, and I was on a soapbox and had lots and lots of wonderful connections around this. I am passionate about investing differently in resilience and have developed this whole resilience investing framework, because if we don't understand resilience, and you think about resilience as bounce back ability, we're not going to survive long enough to then adapt and then to mitigate, right? If you've been hit by a storm and this is your 8th storm in 6 months, how do you build back? How do you bounce back? How do you get back? Right. And so it is absolutely imperative that we really begin to understand why resilience investing now is imperative. So that's one call to action. I am all about accelerating gender smart investing in this space. And so, for example, if you look at our 139 indicators, gender equality doesn't just sit in how we measure the vulnerability of populations. It impacts and is impacted by access to finance, how women participate in political decision making and policy framing. So using machine learning as a repository of institutional knowledge is also really imperative, because how do you then begin to take lessons learned in India and apply them in Africa and apply them in Texas and apply them in Louisiana? And so part of what's missing right now, Sana, is how do you leverage AI and machine learning to have a repository of institutional knowledge where we can scrub that data and then begin to really say, this is how it works. This is how resilience investing works. And this is the real impact that you've created in terms of how do you drive down vulnerability to climate. So that's the call to action, to get serious about it. Lives and livelihoods are on the line, and it has to happen now. And so resilience technologies is coming out of stealth. But if you are an infrastructure investor, if you are a commercial bank, if you're an insurance company, if you are someone who's concerned about the built environment, please be in touch. I'm on LinkedIn, other places. We're coming out of stealth. We're coming out of just the policy and the research, which was required in order to build an index, to saying we need to partner with people who are rolling investment out, people like you, Jada, to say, how do we begin to score so that we really have this aggregated these aggregated data sets that help us to better understand the metrics around resilience. That's what we're doing now. That's the call to action.
Thank you both so much.
Thank
Really
you.
buzzing from those recommendations. And what we'll make sure that the team does is share links to your different organizations and how people can reach you. Really appreciating just the energy and passion that each of you bring to all your work, and floored by your journeys, even though every time I listen to all the things that you've done, and appreciate all you're doing to really create more inclusive and just financial and broader ecosystems that work for everybody. So yes, we will get those links. Thank you both for being part of this conversation today. Good luck with your pioneering in all the things that you do around the intersection of gender and climate finance. It's been a pleasure, and we shall speak to you all soon. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay.